Warm welcome, everybody. Isn't it nice to be around all the human beings? Isn't it nice?
And you lot.
It seems such a long time since we did an NLP group get together. It's just lovely to see so many familiar faces, all wonderful people, and Paul. And
Well, get me on back.
No, it is. It's really lovely. There's always a really warm energy when you're around people who are interested in NLP and personal development because ultimately, if you're interested in NLP and personal development, it means that inevitably you've got a growth mindset, and it means inevitably that you're interested in people. So it creates a kind of a unique atmosphere that you guys know because you've been on the courses. You get to know people really well, don't you? So it's lovely to connect and be together. I know we've had a conversation with various people over the phone and online. It's not quite the same, is it? So it's just lovely to be back again today. And in terms of today, we have a very loose agenda. I know there's some people are coming out for a couple of drinks and maybe some food afterwards, which we're very much looking forward to. But in terms of up here, what's today all about? Well, partly it's about getting together and seeing each other face to face, but also it's about growing confidence around what to do when you first get started with NLP as a coach. Because we both know from our own experience and from numerous conversations with people when they first start, either after practitioner but more likely after master practitioner, that it can sometimes be a bit of a hurdle. It can just sometimes be a bit of a hurdle as to where to start, how to get going, what to think about, and anything that we can do or provide. In fact, we were just talking about it earlier with recording tonight, which is also slightly kind of highly technologically advanced for me anyway, because obviously Craig's not here, he's requested that, and of course anything we can provide as a resource for NLPs going forwards, it's got to be useful. So typically we always start by telling a couple of stories, and I thought we'd do just the same. So I'm going to hand over to Paul.
And good evening, everybody. Just to add that in. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We were just joking there, weren't we, about metaphors, various metaphors, and different stories we have through our lives. I'm not going to tell those stories tonight because it doesn't seem right. I might tell them later, but not now. But Boat and I had a chat beforehand while we were setting things up and thinking, well, actually, what sort of stories do we want to talk about this evening? And it makes sense to talk about, well, maybe some of our successful or maybe slightly less successful first steps in coaching. And I always reflect on when I came on my practitioner course some 9 years ago, I think it is, and Susie, we were on the same master practitioner course, I guess some 8 years ago. I'm not sure what it is now, I might be making those numbers up. Fully enthused to being, here I am, I'm an NLP coach, I'm going to go out and probably change the world by next Thursday. But I had a job as well, so fitting in and diving into delivering coaching was always going to be a challenge. But I would go networking as part of my job role, and I'd spend a lot of time sitting ridiculously early in the morning for these networking meetings that tend to be at 6:30 a.m. or whatever it is, supposedly so that we don't eat into our normal working day. So I'd be there chomping away on my croissants and drinking too much coffee and hoping I'd bump into somebody who would ask me for coaching. The problem was I was not telling everybody I was a coach, so there's a bit of a problem there straight away. But I did get sat down on one particular meeting in Norwich, near the cathedral, beautiful cathedral in Norwich, and I was chatting away to this guy, and I wasn't picking up on the clues, but he was saying to me about how many personal development books he read, and I was like, yeah, I've read loads of those, I find it really interesting. I've done a bit of coaching, as in I've trained to be a coach, and it kept on going, conversation kept going, and what of course I wasn't realising that the poor guy was saying, I want to be coached, but he wasn't perhaps saying those words, but eventually, after watching whatever the presentation was that was on that morning on some random subject that filled the networking slot, I ended up sat next to him, and we continued our conversation, and finally I said, should I grab a coffee sometime and maybe we can see where that conversation will go. And where it went eventually was for him to complete a motivational map, which I trained in at the same time as my initial NLP training. Had a conversation about his motivational map, and then eventually it got to the point where he actually said to me, "So how much do you charge?" I wasn't really sure what to say at that point.
It's funny listening to Paul, it just reminded me about one of my first conversations. Actually, was at the leisure centre at Huntingdon, so I was doing a bit of moonlighting but didn't realise it. And there was a chap who I was actually a bit afraid of, a bit scared of, because there's a guy called Dave. He had real presence, and he did a lot of work with the leisure centres on a kind of buildings and maintenance basis. And he was just moaning to me about the fact how he was so busy, and it was a real unusual, because he always presented this veneer, so I was quite surprised to hear that he was just opening up and basically just moaning and ranting at me. And I suggested he might want to consider complete a motivational map, which he did. And I sat down and spoke to him, and I remember saying the most, not most inappropriate, because it wasn't inappropriate, but with really lacking confidence, would you be interested in coming for a coaching session? I've got the results in front of me. He was a guy who's 10 out of 10 motivated to earn money, 10 out of 10 fulfilled, 10 out of 10 fulfilled around power, control, influence, 1 out of 10 freedom and independence. And he was telling me that his PA was running his life, and he didn't know how to not be doing what he's currently doing in the next 10 years, but he didn't know how to not be. And so it was all there. It was a bit of a slam dunk, really. And he said yes, which really surprised me. It's funny, isn't it, when you're trying to juggle lots of things? Because I remember that time, because I'd got started, I was coaching, and I was seeing clients, and they were coming from where I was. They were coming from my workplace, people I knew, because I had learned something. I hadn't realised I'd learned it, but one of the things I had learned was to tell my story. I was telling people, and this came up in an online call with Jonathan's group last night, that actually, if you're going to attract people to you, you need to tell your story. So I was telling my story about how I'd been afraid of failure, and I'd not turned up for county cricket trials, and I'd carried around that disappointment with me, and I felt like a failed sportsman. And I was telling that story, and it was resonating with people, and people were being interested. And I hadn't realised until right now how important that is. That you have to actually, if you're going to coach people, be vulnerable and open up and explain to people how things have affected you and the journey that you've been on. Because if you do that, then you will magnify people to you. Anyway, so things are going really well. Except there is one missing skill that I didn't yet have, and some would say still don't have. And that is, it's also useful to be slightly organised. So this particular day sticks out in my mind quite well, because I was doing well at telling those stories and connecting with people, and all of a sudden coaching clients were arriving at various times. Some people commenting on my fluffy slippers when they arrived at the door. And so yeah, and it was great. It were busy, days were busy. I was seeing clients in the morning, then going to work, and then sometimes I'd be driving off from work, see a client going back to work, all sorts of stuff going on. One particular day I was rushing, because I was leaving a coaching client at home to dash to the leisure centre to go to work. And I was rushing, right? And of course when you're rushing, you've got that kind of urgency going on, haven't you? We've all done it. We all still do it. So I was driving whilst rushing. We've probably all done that as well. And it's funny what happens when you're rushing. So I was driving, and Blunsham is a little village that Mark's now getting to know inside out. So I was driving, and there's a fruit farm just on the outskirts of Blunsham, between Blunsham and what we quite lovely to frame as the poo farm. So we're driving, we'll explain that further later, or not. So I'm driving towards the poo farm, past the fruit farm, and a farm vehicle turns the corner. And he's on the right side of the road, which is great, so I can do that bit. And it's a summer's day, and there's a box of fruit on the back, and he goes, choo, 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 right in front of my car, hits the front bonnet, hits the side panel, hits the back side panel, somehow hit the back panel, not sure how he did that, took the wing, according to the insurance company, took the wing mirror off, and I've ground to a halt. And then I've managed to drive about 10 miles an hour the rest of the way to get to the leisure centre. Missed a lot of meetings. There's like the bonnet kind of screeching along the floor as I'm going along. get into the leisure centre, and I kind of come into it. I've kind of almost let go of the day. I've obviously missed the meetings. I've rung people. I've come in to see my assistant manager, a lovely guy called Wayne, some of which you may have met on various courses or even at events like this. And I explained to Wayne what had happened, and Wayne's comment blew me away. He said, "Oh, that's interesting, boss. What would the law of attraction say about that?"
I just want to pick up on your organisational skills more than anything else. We could put together a whole workshop on your organisational skills, couldn't we? But this isn't a metaphor, it's literally just something that just came into my mind as you said that. I used to go and see Bevis in his home office when we first met. Did my motivational map training in your office, at your house. And I'd go and see Bevis on a fairly regular basis. And we'd set up a meeting on a Friday afternoon, and I managed to, because I was still working, still in paid employment, so I managed to engineer my week so that I was nearby on a Friday afternoon, and similar, was driving along thinking, got to get there on time, don't want to be late, got to get there on time. I arrived on time, got out of the car, took a deep breath, as I always did before I went to see Bevis, because you never know what's going to happen. And I knocked on the door. And I waited. And I knocked again, and waited some more. And I thought, this is a bit odd, because I can't actually see his car here. So I rang him. I said, where are you, Bevis? You're in the office. I said, no, you're not. He said, yes, I am. I went, explain that to me. Because what he'd forgotten to add into us arranging that meeting was that was the time when he'd moved office. He was actually no longer in his house office, he was in Piddly. So remembering to tell people where you are is a good starting point for inviting your clients along.
And then you immediately remind you of 3 other stories there, but it's interesting at the start today. So let's tell metaphors. The purpose of these metaphors are going to help you to relax and realise they don't have to be perfect. Well, you could have eased off a little bit.
It's such a long list.
And that's the thing, right? You don't have to be perfect. I can guarantee you, the person who's made the most mistakes with coaching and NLP in this room is me, by far. Just by fact, I've kind of done more of it. So it's not about perfection. You always know. It's amazing how often as a coach you read one book, and that's the one book that is the right book for that next person. So when coaching, I spoke to Sean Billings the other day. Anybody know Sean? Sean has stopped coaching, except he hasn't. Because he said, you know what, Bevis, I stopped in COVID because it all disappeared. And you know what I realised? I didn't miss it. He said it's a skill. I can do it really well, and he can. He's bloody good. But it's not the right thing for me. I love computers. But what he's now doing is incorporating NLP into his computer business. And he's actually helping people with computers whilst giving them a little nudge around all the other things that come up conversationally. Because sometimes we can fall into a trap, can't we, NLP, of anything really. We learn it and then we compare ourselves to other people. Everybody's journey is unique. And you never really know. Paul couldn't have predicted being sat there. I couldn't have been sat here. Sean Billings couldn't have been predicting running his computer business but incorporating NLP into it. Because you cannot really not use it because it's all about language. And you use language every day. Because sometimes people say, yeah, I've not really used that. And then they start asking questions like, oh, what specifically do you mean by that, Bevis? You can't not use it, can you, really? So, it seems now we've unpicked my lack of organisation skills.
Well, there's another story.
It reminds me of the time I put petrol in my diesel just on the way to seeing a client, but I really have done it all, honestly. So
basically, whatever Bevis has done, as long as you don't do that, you'll be alright.
So one of the things that we want to share with you today is about how to get started with a client, what you can do, what to think about. I'm going to kind of plant a seed now. It'd be really useful to do a demonstration at some point this evening. So if there's any volunteers, sorry. If there's anybody who's happily willing volunteer, that would be great. Equally, we're not going to force anything. So if we get somebody who's happy to be a volunteer, then we'll ask you a few questions and see where that leads. So we're not going to do that right away, but we will do that. We're also going to give out some scripts. So Jules has started coaching, which is great, apart from the fact now some of the materials that I've created over the years are now being picked to pieces. So that's the other reason that we're here, is that Jules kind of pointed out that this detailed personal history script that we have in our Master Practitioner Manual, which is great, but it's not, because there are words between the words, if that makes sense. She said, no, you don't quite do it like that, do you? And I was like, no, I don't. She says, and of course, I was speaking to Sean about this the other day, it's not about, you're never going to find a perfect script because every person's different. But it's really, I found when I first got started that just having something, a place to start, is really useful. So really part of the purpose of today is to demonstrate what might sit in between the questions. And if you make your own notes, then you'll feel like if you choose to coach and you choose to use a structure, then you've got a framework to use. Would that be good?
Yeah.
Awesome. But before we get into that, what if we're going to have a coaching session with somebody, what do we need to think about? What are the other things we need to think about that you might take for granted?
Which office are they coming to?
Yeah. Which office are you? Or even having an office. Where are you going to do it? Where are you going to do it? Because there is an appropriateness of space. I coached the first 2 or 3 years from home, and we had a nice home office that worked. Less useful when there were 2-year-olds crawling through the door in the middle of the sessions. So it is about thinking about the appropriateness of the space. So that is something, and there are shared coaching spaces. Crikey, we're in a coach house hub with shared coaching spaces downstairs. But it was worth thinking about that and paying some attention to that. What else do we need to think about? Rapport. Yeah. Because I mean, it's interesting. We did a motivational map coach training recently, training motivational mappers in some of the elements of NLP online during COVID. It's tricky. And I asked one of the ladies, a lady called Melanie, who's a very experienced career coach, and said, what was the thing that you got out of it the most? And she blew me away. She said, rapport. I thought, wow. Because sometimes we just don't slow down. If we're really thinking about what we're doing, we sometimes just don't quite slow down enough. So rapport. How long does it take to build rapport?
I think as well is if people are running late or they bring their negative energy in or things like that, it's part of the environment and part of the rapport. So if you went to a bank manager or you went to a doctor, you wouldn't talk about money or health straight away. So rapport, I think, is just making people feel easy, how was your journey or whatever it was, and get people to ease into it, particularly if they rush to you. And I've seen good meetings start well when you let people settle in, or people come in with their own drama, and if you don't slow them down, you won't get the effect you want from the session.
I think just picking up on that as well, and we've already mentioned the environment, the type of office. Now, if you are using in a space that you are comfortable with, that's great for you, isn't it? So it's just being also mindful of the individual who's coming to see you as to the type of environment they would want to be in. Because that doesn't matter how much time you spend building rapport, if they're uncomfortable in that environment, that's going to be a struggle. And I've had a few people like that over the years where I think is a perfect space to meet, perhaps wasn't so perfect for them. So it's, just keeping that in mind as well. And having flexibility of meeting space.
Often they come to the first meeting, they're a bit anxious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas you know what it is, you're in your own space.
Yeah.
They're just walking like here, making the effort to walk down the drive and say, I'm coming here for help or whatever. Yeah. It's a huge shift for a lot of people.
Very true.
They need nurturing from the minute they walk in.
Yeah. And that's a very good point. And there's an underlying belief that I didn't realise was there until Sean was speaking there. I believe that the clients make 50% of the journey to overcoming whatever they're needing to overcome just by turning up. Because the hardest journey is actually the one to show up in the first place. You've got to overcome so much. There's so much courage. I have complete respect for people who turn up for coaching, because they've actually overcome so much. I think about all the voices of doubt and cynicism that they've overcome to get there in the first place. So we really want to kind of respect.
They've also got to accept within themselves that they either need help or willing to try something different to move forward. That's a huge step for most people to actually say, yeah, I do need help, or I do want to sort this, or I do need to do something.
On on the plus side of that situation, because that can take a long time to get somebody into a position where they are comfortable to walk up the drive or come to the office, whatever it might be, to go through that vulnerable phase of presenting themselves for coaching. There's an opportunity there as well for you as a coach of how you best handle that part of it as you are encouraging the person to feel safe, to feel secure, to feel it's okay to be vulnerable, and creating that safe space for them before they even enter the coaching room, as it were. And that comes down to your phone calls, your contact through email, your Zoom calls or online, whatever it might be, of really re-emphasising some of the key presuppositions of NLP, of respecting the other person's map of the world. Yeah, for those of us who've been coaching for some time, we know the effect it can have, and it's a safe space, of course it is. But as Sean's rightly pointed out, that person has made a decision to come for help and they don't know that stuff. Yeah, they hear the words detailed personal history. And if you just remove from your mind for a moment what we know about detailed personal history, and we're going to present that phrase to somebody in the street, that sounds quite scary, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm going to be entering an office with somebody I don't know particularly well, and we're going to go detail into my personal history. It brings back the bike sheds again, doesn't it? You know, but it's just creating that level of safety through rapport for your client.
And I think part of rapport is warmth.
Yeah.
So in the language you use when you're replying to people, and people want reassurance. It doesn't have to be that obvious, but with warmth and rapport, they're closely linked. And I think the other thing, without making it too contrived, is what's going to be your opening statement. What are you going to say to make them feel comfortable? You know, and it doesn't, you know, you won't know sometimes with some people, but it's important that you have that because you'll be nervous as well. And if you've got that opening statement ready to go, well, I really appreciate it coming. When we spoke last, or whatever it is, then all of a sudden it starts to flow.
Yeah.
And then that nervousness and that flow starts. I think all those things are very important because it's part of being humanistic and it's natural. It just flows.
Let's just pause for a minute on this because I think this is important. So, because I think the point here is a good one. Well, often the anxiety of seeing a client for the first time stops people from actually doing it. There's lots of nods in the room, so everybody's either experienced it, they've either experienced it or it's kind of got in the way, and therefore when you do have a first client, you are actually likely to be feeling anxious. So the rapport building phase is for you as much as the client, to help you to relax and to feel comfortable. And of course, in NLP, what do we know about building rapport? What's important? So if you look at
Body language.
yeah, look at how you're all sat. We're all sat, like literally, I've never seen a room, other than Paul,
Other
who's
than
just,
me,
I've seen that before.
other than Paul, Paul's a Cure fan, I mean, what can you say? Everybody else is 100% matched and mirrored until Jules ran forward a minute ago. So it's that body language, and none of you were sat there doing it consciously, you did it naturally because you're all unconsciously competent at building rapport. So there's body language, and then of course, what word did Graham use a moment ago? Warmth. There's a strong kinesthetic preference there. So just starting with some kinesthetic words, kinesthetic, auditory, visual, a bit auditory, visual. So you can use that as well in your toolkit. And what else could you do? Because sometimes we forget how much we've learned. What could you give to a client before they even turned up? What could you ask them to complete?
You could get them to complete detailed, I'm losing my words.
That's okay.
You could get them to basically prepare and understand.
I mean, I've formulated a sheet of questions that I use now, and we all do slightly different things. And it's interesting the reaction I have with clients when I send that sheet of questions, because it looks at different areas, so your self-perception, your perception of others, from a spiritual point of view, a deeper point of view, but it doesn't mention the word spiritual, but that's kind of in there. Because there will be the sort of questions that you will be asking as a coach at some point. Now, I've had a mixed response from those questions. Some people, it gets sent out and we don't talk about it. We don't refer to it, but they were sent. To the other extent of having it sent out within 10 minutes, I've had someone come back to me saying, when do you want this homework completed? And it's like, well, actually it's not homework. But as you rightly say, it's an opportunity to frame the type of stuff that we might be exploring, which can go some way to giving a sense of that vulnerability is going to be managed in a safe way again. But I'm also interested, sorry to carry on with this, but I'm also interested that when you got nods around the room of people saying about how we feel on that first session, and what might prevent us from doing it, I'll be curious to see if we can share some thoughts around what that is. And for me, when I have those feelings, and had those feelings at the early days of coaching, it was, am I going to have all the answers? Am I going to have an outcome for the client? These are the things that are going through my mind. Feel free to share if you've got any thoughts of what might be getting in the way of you making the first steps in those sessions. Or maybe both of you've got any.
Well, I think that you've hit the nail on the head. Often we worry about not knowing enough. But that's not coaching, that's mentoring.
I think it's a clunkiness that worries me.
See, that was one for me, but then I realised when I sat down with my first coaching client, they haven't got a clue what I'm meant to be doing. So it didn't matter. I think because in masters everyone knows the techniques that you're using, so if you get it wrong it's a bit like, Whereas with a coaching client, they haven't got the first clue if you've read the questions in the wrong order, So once I realised that, I was like, actually, I relaxed a lot and thought, well, I'm going to add value in some way. It might not be today, but it will be at some point.
I think it's the thing about is the extending of what you just said about being perfect and about the clunkiness. That's the real thing that swirls around. But then you get hung up with a technique. So when I first came to the first NLP thing, I didn't know whether I was coming as a would-be coach or coming as Graham. And I think sometimes when you're coaching people, you're trying to think about the technique, and it sometimes nullifies you really being in the room and listening, because you're trying to think, well, what technique can I use before you even started?
Yeah, that's the really.
And you're trying to think like an expert, and it kills the natural flow of where the conversation could go. Whereas you can sit there and say, do a lot of fact finding, and then you might be like a swan going on a river. You might be petrified, but they won't know. And then you can come out of the session and go, well, I spoke to Bevis, I spoke to somebody else. Oh, when they come next time, I can use that. But you think everything has to happen instantaneously at that moment.
And that, you've just hit the nail on the head, Graham, the difference between people who are, what happens when you first get started with NLP, as opposed to people who are very experienced with NLP. The people who are more experienced in NLP actually use less and less techniques. Whereas when you first learn NLP, it's all about the techniques. I want to have a go at, and especially when you do the trainers training, because we were both manufacturing ways of practicing all the techniques, because we needed the practice. So it becomes less technique led, and really that's part of what tonight's all about, really. Because I remember going through a detailed person history and some coaching around that and some tasking around that. And please take on board Paul's point about tasking before the first session. As soon as somebody's accepted a task, they've also accepted that they're becoming a client. There's a journey. So there's this thing, for me, a coaching session isn't a coaching session unless the client's got a task afterwards. That has to be one thing. But that is because it's not all about, that takes the emphasis off you working magic. You haven't got a magic wand. The client's making the changes themselves.
One of those tasks, I suppose, before you've even met them, could be to get them to do the rep test, and then you know when they arrive already what their preference is.
And the beauty in that, of course, with rep tests or motivational map, whatever it might be, they are now on the journey of self-exploration, because everybody loves finding out stuff about themselves. So they see that, they get the result, they're on their way. But of course, as you rightly say, it's now opening the door for us to see what's going on with the client, to be able to ask the right questions when they come in. And talking of asking the right questions, I was speaking with a wonderful coach that some of you know, a guy called Craig, just putting it out there. And I was having a coffee with him yesterday, and we were talking about coaching generally. And he had a realisation recently that actually, instead of coming up with all the answers, it's being prepared to ask the right questions. Because if you are asking the right question to your client, guess what? It's them that's working out what they need to do. So it takes some pressure off you to think, actually, we've got an hour together or 2 hours together, whatever it might be. if I don't make significant change in this 2 hours, they're going to feel that I'm a fraud. And we don't need to. We can let go of that, because it's just about asking the right questions for the client then to work it out.
Because whose responsibility is it to change?
Clients.
So you can take all that pressure off. You take all that, and that's, look, I'm not saying that happens overnight, because it's about detachment from the outcome. It's like when you have a conversation with somebody that's a bit awkward. You know you need to say what you need to say, but you don't expect it to change. You just need to get it off your chest. It's the same with coaching. You need to facilitate, but you can't force a change. That's down to the client. So if you see yourself as a facilitator of change, and the responsibility for change is firmly placed with the client, then you've got an appropriate framework. It might be one of the things that you talk about with the client before you start. I think I've told the story before about Professor Nigel McClellan, and he said there were 4 keys to coaching. Can anyone remember what the 4 keys to coaching were from his work? Any ideas? Intuitive questions. Now, if they're intuitive, are they like to go on script?
No.
So there's an interesting piece, isn't it? So this is the intuitive type questioning. So intuitive questioning, and if you're going to ask intuitive questions, what state do you need to be in?
Not fixed.
Say that again?
Not fixed in what you want to do.
Yeah, oh gosh, yeah. I mean, that's not coaching, that's training. And there's nothing wrong either way, by with training, and we'll worry about, is this training or mentoring or coaching? It doesn't really matter. If I've seen Paul take clients up here and start teaching them NLP, if that's what's needed to get results, that's what you do. But yeah, it's if you're going to ask an intuitive question, you need to be in what state? Relaxed. Yeah.
And actively listening as well. I think that's the
Yeah.
thing. It's easy to be in your own head thinking about what's coming next rather than really listening to what the client is saying. Because that's like the only time you can intuitively question is when you're properly.
And this is where finally my disorganisation becomes a benefit.
You found
It
it.
had
You
to
found
come
it.
in somewhere. Because if you've done no preparation,
If you're the queen of winging.
Queen of Women.
So what's to do with delusionary clients?
now I'm not saying that preparation is a bad thing, as long as you can then be in the moment with your client. But if you prepared your session, Jonathan, you're not quite like when you were telling that metaphor to the student. There'd been an element of preparation, but when you were telling it, you'd have been in the moment, right? And it was that got the result with the client. You being absolutely in the moment with the client. So that's where the magic happens. Intuitive questioning means you have to be present.
I think before you move on to the next pillars, just to keep you on track, the intuitive questioning, I think there's also another element to focus in on here, in being in a calm, relaxed state, being curious, hence the curiosity. But also, if your intuition there's a questioning that's bubbling up because you intuitively feel it's right to ask that question, you also need to be prepared to be wrong. Yeah, that if your intuition is leading you somewhere, it's far better to ask that question with a complete non-judgment, to be able to say, that leads me to think that maybe you're thinking in this way, or I'm curious as to how that works for you. And it may have nothing to do with what the individual is relaying to you, but it's your position to ask the question, because there's some intuition that's gone on there. And then if we get the right response, or a response that then gives us a direction, well, okay, we can move on from that. But be prepared to be wrong. I've been wrong many times.
Continue to.
And continue.
So what these pillars of effective coaching, what have we got? What have we talked about so far?
Intuitive question.
Intuitive questioning. So yeah, let's strip that down here.
Nothing's going in tonight, Jane. I'm so tired.
Intuitive questioning. And before we ask any intuitive questions, what do we do right at the outset?
Build rapport.
Report. Love it. And of course we build rapport through our body language and our tonality. We know that as NLPs we might have their rep system test before they start. They may have already completed the task before we've met them. You then build rapport, and you might even start telling a few stories. I met Kevin, who some people did their training with today. He came for a coaching session, and I was talking to him, and We were talking about a holiday that we've just been on in Filey, and I was mentioning Jules' mum, how she likes her children around her, and he starts talking about how his mum really struggled when her children left home. And then we started talking about that, and he described that as empty nest syndrome, which actually isn't a term I'd heard before. So we got talking about that. I said, well, one of the things I know from my experience is that most people are looking for either fulfilment or the ability to be true to themselves. And then he said, well, that's weird, because that's what I've come to talk to you about. Because he's selling his business, and he's a bit like, what next? What next? So, why have I told you that story? Part of rapport building could be metaphors. And actively listening and telling stories is part of, because if you tell a story, it's funny where that leads, isn't it, sometimes? Just conversation, but it's amazing if you're in the moment with a client and you're really listening, then often this stuff can almost, it's like the session started while we're having a cup of coffee, really. It wasn't part of the plan. I had no idea what he was going to come talk to you about. So if we're really listening, it can sometimes flow like that. Sometimes it doesn't. In fact, most of the time it doesn't. We've just got lucky today. Is that okay? So rapport, metaphors, relaxation, because we need to be relaxed. What else? What else is important pillars of coaching?
You said environment.
Yeah, environment. So I'm going to put stuff that we're going to think of right at the outset there, kind of in this top corner, almost in the rapport building stage. Oh, because we've talked about tasks as well, haven't we, over here?
And then pre-work, how do you go about the pre-work? What do you want them to do before? Because you're transferring ownership from that get-go by actually saying, you've got to think about this.
Yeah.
So back to Sean's point, sometimes people sit there, they think you're going to fix them. Whereas if you start from the early stages saying you need to think about inadvertently what you're trying to fix, it's a whole different ballgame.
Has anybody ever had that? Somebody come to and say, can you do that NLP stuff for me? Fix me.
Can you just press a button and make it all okay?
Yeah. I mean, you can't. I mean,
if you had a client come to you and want to stop smoking, so you're doing hypnosis or something like that, you don't just say, yeah, okay, come and the first thing you do is they've rung up and said they want to stop smoking, and then you've got to say to them, why do you want to stop smoking? What benefit are you getting from smoking? What's stopping you? So you say to them, it's bad for your health, it's bad for your wealth, it's antisocial, your clothes stink. But what are you getting out of it? And then you see them 2 weeks later, they've had 2 weeks of therapy of actually analysing themselves, saying, why am I doing this?
Love it. So I love that. So there's a couple of great things there. Tasks or pre-work, and that pre-work might be just a little bit of self-reflection, self-analysis, so just stepping back and observing patterns, which is great. You might do none of that pre-work. There's no finite rules, but the rapport is a pillar. All of these things sit around it. The thing that really is coming home strongly, that I think is the thing that people often struggle with, is the responsibility for change. It's the most important thing, because it's a bit like trying to coach your parents or your children. Why can't you coach your parents or your children?
Lots of reasons.
Lots of reasons.
You're part of the problem.
It's I'm fairly sure that most of us are attached to our kids' outcomes, right? Like, I really want Aidan and Ellie to live a happy, I'm happy that I'm more detached than most, but I'm still attached to their outcomes. So why do kids resist what their parents tell them? Because they sense that attachment. So you can't, somebody told me a metaphor about gardens and reaching over into the wrong garden when they take too much. You stay in the coach lane and let the client be in the client lane, because if you start taking ownership for their outcomes, they won't actually appreciate it. Has anybody ever experienced resistance from trying to help somebody who didn't really want to be helped? You know it, right? So we must stay, and this is part of the pre-frame, that one of the 4 keys to effective coaching is responsibility for outcome is with the client. So we must frame, and it is a must. Now you can frame, I don't frame that consciously, I don't say that. I just make it inherent in all of the conversations throughout that first session. And it's actually inherent in the tasking as well. Is that okay? And it's a big, and I'm also saying that's the difficult bit, because it's what stops people from.
You can actually say it to the client.
You can. Well, I actually think I would. It's easier to say it than it is to suggest it subliminally. Like I try to do my best to. So say it. Explain actually the responsibility for. And it's one of the 4 keys to effective coaching is that clients are responsible for their own outcomes.
There's another element in there that I've only really just kind of thought about whilst we've been discussing it, that the examples we just sort of like picked up on smoking and more therapeutic coaching of helping people with their outcomes. There's another angle as well, particularly when coaching and working with people in business, with business owners and senior management and successful people who come to you for coaching. Their outcome is their outcome. And I've spoken with other coaches and experienced this myself of questioning myself as to if this person is so much more successful than I am, why am I working with them as a coach?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, and I've coached some very successful people and ended up enjoying what they enjoy. I've been in a racing car recently of a client, and it was a wonderful experience. Yeah, and they're really successful people. But if I start comparing my life to their life, then I'm not going to be able to help them.
No.
And that's the thing, and the responsibility with the client is whatever their outcome is, you work on their outcome. And let go of comparing yourself to your client as well. In those, because we will, and you will, end up working with people who are highly successful individuals. And there's some reassurance in that, in the sense that even the most highly successful people have stuff that they want to work on, and you can help them with that. So their outcome is their outcome, whether it's giving up smoking or whether I should sell my multi-million-pound business. We can help them with the tools. And
I had a good analogy about it's almost like being a third eye for somebody.
Yeah.
You know, when you can think if you want to help them with that, you're almost like being their third eye, or we're adding some dimension to their life that's missing.
Yeah.
Then it takes away some of that sort of, I remember going and asking for a bank loan once, and the guy said, "How'd you earn that much money?" or something at that time, and it completely floored me, you know, because, you know, so I think you've got to be careful being in balance with people, because they're trusting you to be their guide, really.
Yeah.
You like to be their third eye. You know?
Absolutely.
And just as well on this success trend, just for a moment, at the elite end of what success might be for some people, does elite levels of success equate to balance?
No.
Because success in achievement terms is only one phase of life. We know this. We go through focusing on relationships, achievement. If we look at Maslow, and then we focus on personal development and growth. So, I mean, that particular challenge that Paul described was unpicked for me when somebody said to me when I was coaching, and it was a challenge I was given directly. I was coaching golfers, and some of them were professional golfers, and my peer, my leisure centre manager colleague, said, "How on earth can you coach golfers? These are better golfers than you." And I was like, "Well, I'm fairly sure Tiger Woods' coach isn't a better golfer than Tiger Woods." It's a crazy concept, really, when we think about it, because coaching, when somebody hires Paul as a coach, they don't hire him because he's an elite level multi-billion-pound business owner.
Yeah.
They hire him because he's a great coach, because he's got great coaching skills. There's nobody on the planet with your level of skill and experience. You are the only person who has the skills and experience that you have.
I've got a story I've got to tell at this point. I've probably told it a few times before to people. When I first introduced some coaching when I worked for Argos, with a company called Lane 4, that was headed up by a swimmer called Adrian Morehouse, that was particularly famous, I think, late 80s. And his first Olympics, he was told he was the best swimmer that the UK had produced, and got to the final, got to Lane 4, the best lane to compete in, dived in, one length, he was way out in front, and on the way back he tired and ended up 7th, and was ridiculed in the press and nearly gave up swimming altogether, and made a decision to change coach. And over the next 3 years was working with this coach, building his confidence back up, building his skills to where it needed to be to the next Olympics. And he went to that Olympics, competed through all the heats, got to the final, got to Lane 4, dived in, did length, back again, won the gold medal. no problem at all. And the key part of that story, because he put it all that success he attributed to his new coach. His new coach can't swim. And that to me is the essence of coaching, and the fact that actually you do not have to be the best at something to be able to help somebody else succeed in their chosen field. So his coach couldn't swim, yet he was the one that made the difference. And in fact, sometimes that can be a massive advantage, because you're not going to be overlaying your model of how to do that thing on somebody else. Which is why you work with golfers, because of course you play your golf in a certain way that no one wants to play.
Not like that, wish I could.
But the point is, yeah, you don't have to be an expert in order to help other people achieve expertise in their field.
You don't have to be an expert at coaching either. You just have to be able to master these pillars, or at least be learning these pillars. So look, I think really there's one thing that we haven't covered. What do we focus on in NLP? The word came out a moment ago from Paul. What do we focus on in NLP that say counselling, which is great by the way. What's the difference say between counselling and coaching in terms of what we focus on?
Positives.
Positives. So it's kind of, there's a solution focus. And what do you write on an NLP course? Yeah. So there's an outcome. There is for coaching, there is a goal / an outcome. So literally every single coaching client I've ever seen, have I given them the task of writing a vision. Every single one. Now I might not always do that in the first session like I used to. That might come further down the journey at various times. Sometimes it takes quite a while for them to actually complete that task. But every single person at some point on the coaching journey I'll ask to write a vision, because there's a difference. Counselling is great because you're getting stuff out of here and it's offload. We all know the benefit of just offloading. That's why one of the reasons why female mental health is better than men, because men speak half as much, say half as many words. So there's definite value in just offloading.
Sure, that's put in Paul's case.
Depends when the camera's on me or not, you know. So.
That's what the spotlight's for. You see the positioning of the spotlight, so we know so
Bounces off his head. That's
so yeah, so we just need to make sure if we're covering those 4 bases and we keep learning and growing, then we're doing a lot good.
I think what's also what I've found, certainly through the clients I've worked with, that these, as with all the stuff we talk about, with the detailed personal history script and the training we deliver, these are suggested ways, frameworks in which to operate. Because that goal, outcome and vision, if you do have a client who comes in and they say this is what I want, through intuitive questioning, through building a rapport that we've already done, knowing that the responsibility is back to the client, the chances are that by the time you spend some time with the client, that goal will change anyway. And so it should always be moving forward. It should always be a movable thing, a flexible goal. Because actually, if you achieve, and then the apple tree, we use that here all the time, once you have reached the apple tree, there'll be stuff beyond that. So what your goal is when you start will be very different as you work through the process.
it's not the person. It's not
Often the client hasn't got a clue what they're coming for. Just knows something's not quite right.
Yeah.
Well, that's the perfect segue into the demo, because that's exactly what happens. The client doesn't really know why they're there; they just feel uncomfortable. So your job at the outset is to help them feel more comfortable, and to a place where they feel comfortable being uncomfortable, and then to have some clarity of what it is they actually want. So that you've just hit the perfect frame, Sean. For me, that is the outcome. And in the pre-talk with the client, that is what I'm working on. I'll say to the client, what you should expect from the first session with me is to become more aware of, have greater clarity of what you want, and also greater clarity of what's in the way of you realising that. And that is a good frame for a first session with the NLP, and I can say this in this room, with the NLP skills that you guys have already, and the coaching skills you have already, that is a good frame, that you can help them have more clarity of what they're after in their life. Because they'll say it, if you ask them, they'll tell you they want more clarity anyway. That's guaranteed one of the results that they're after. So I would say within 20 minutes of a coaching session, framed appropriately, you can help the client have greater clarity. So we ought to probably do, when I asked the question if anybody wanted to be a volunteer, Graham nodded, so you can take the pressure off yourself now. If you were thinking, oh my God, he might put me on the spotlight and ask me, we've already got a willing volunteer. So that's good, because we're going to start with the demo. We're going to give some scripts out as well. I'm just curious before we start, who's coming out tonight, just out of interest? Who's out for some socialising kind of, okay, cool, awesome. We should look forward to that. Yeah, Susie's depending on energy levels, Susie's
I'm in
thinking.
the same place as you.
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to, but I just don't know whether I have
Whether you can-
energy for it.
No worries.
Then if I go home, the mother-in-law says they've got some questioning me, so might find some
Can
energy.
you get your pen? I would left my pen in the car.
We can do that.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
It's Sue said you drive.
The only problem with that, Greg, is you probably not have a lot of time for writing.
Yeah, I know. Voiceable and retarded.
He was convinced. He just
I'm not asking you because you're just all of us anyway.
It's not, yeah. And then just,
Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
That's very kind of you.
Well done, but yeah, I'll go and take. Sorry,
Thank you very much.
let me check it works.
oh, I've got one, I've got another one.
That's very kind. Thank you.
So what we've given you there is actually, it's a detailed personal history script out of the Master Practitioner Manual. So it's a Master Practitioner, taking a detailed personal history is a Master Practitioner of NLP process. And as an NLP Master Practitioner, you'd be looking then to help the client let go of limiting beliefs, to help them let go of inner conflicts, to help them let go of negative emotions from the past. But you can also use it in coaching to help people raise their awareness of their stuff. Because as Tad James, I keep saying famously said, but not many people heard him say it. As Tad James famously said, is there anything Timeline therapy can't do? Yes, it can't help somebody let go of something they're not aware of. So in order to let go of something, like an emotion, or a limiting belief, or a doubt, which is also a limiting belief, in order to let go of something, we have to be aware of what it is. So if you go in and say, right, I'm going to do timeline therapy to you, Paul, you'll do something, you'll have some impact, because you'll help Paul let go of what he's aware of, but you'll have way more impact if you help him to become aware of what he wants in his life and what is blocking him. And if somebody's in their comfort zone, are they going to become aware of what's blocking them? Because they're in the comfort zone. So while they're comfortable, they're not going to become aware of what's blocking them. So clients will either arrive, well, most clients will arrive when they're feeling pretty terrible, and it's the away from motivation that's got them there. Or, and this is the smaller percentage case, if they are just curious, which is great, or they have a big goal and they're struggling to move forward. So part of this thing of helping the client have the goal is to help get them out of the comfort zone so they become aware of what's actually blocking them. Does that make sense? Because if you get them to aim for, I was having a conversation today, somebody was saying they were going to have to cut their cloth accordingly and they were going to stop flying. I said, I'm just curious, because I was following intuition. Do you enjoy flying? Oh yeah. But he was cutting his cloth accordingly. Sounds like somebody told him that would be a good idea at some point. Just sold his business for a lot of money. So if you think, but this is what happens, right? We have these rules. So the part of the coaching was, well, actually, what do you want to have in your life? Do you enjoy flying? Oh yeah, well, let's make sure flying's in your goal then, because you enjoy it. If he'd said, no, I don't really enjoy it, I just do it because it looks good to other people, that would have been different. But he really enjoys it. So the purpose of the goal is to help the client get out of their comfort zone, so then they become aware of actually what's blocking them for achieving a better quality of life. Is that okay? Because if the goal isn't stretching, then you won't become aware of, and they won't become aware of what's blocking them. They'll just stay where they are. And there's nothing wrong with comfort zone. But it's a good thing for a period of time. But we tend to want to go through periods of being comfortable and then periods of being stretched. You don't want to spend too long in either. You want to kind of comfortable, stretch, comfortable. That's kind of how life ought to evolve, really. Everybody happy? Cool. So what I'd like, thank you Graham, give Graham a round of applause for being I'm aware of the time, so we want to make sure we do our best to finish in time for social activity. But what I think would be useful is if people just scribble away, make notes, scribble on the detailed person history script, or just put your pens away and just absorb whatever you absorb, whatever's fine for you. But just from your own filters, whatever you learn from tonight that's useful, just make a note of it so that sheet of paper becomes useful for you. Does anybody have any questions before we start? Everybody quite happy?
Mm-hmm. Just on that note, just to, by all means take notes, but we'll make the video available so that you'll be able to follow up on that if you want to just stay focused on what Bevis and Graham are talking about.
Cool. Everybody happy? You alright, Jonathan?
Is that technology in your hand?
There is technology. I'm so glad you noticed. Yes. No, this is and very useful too, actually. So yeah, it's called Remarkable. It basically means it's got rather than the thousands of bits of paper that I used to lose. So yeah, and I will erase whatever's. If there's anything that comes up, Graham, I shall happily delete whatever comes up.
No, don't worry about it. Presumably Jules told you about it.
She did. She did.
I just was fed up of having to bring his coaching notes over to here that we got at home.
So now forget that.
now we just leave that at home.
Between you and Jules, we really are kind of unpicking this thing about having to be perfect, aren't we? We've kind of we've done that. Good.
Yeah.
Graham, well, awesome, mate. Come and grab the hot seat. Let's give him a round of applause. Come on. Oh yeah, of course. That's part of the gig. So Graham, we're not currently working together as coach or client. This is completely, we're not doing any work at the moment, are we?
No.
So this is a real client. Well, I think. Just checking. So
No, hologram.
so I'm just going to be asking Graham some questions, and again, the purpose of a coaching session is ideally we want to get greater clarity of what the client's looking for, what Graham's looking for, and also any awareness of what might be holding him back slightly. And if we can achieve both those things, then that'd be great. Cool. So obvious first question, which seems a bit strange in this context, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it is a question that I would ask. So, if this was a real coaching session, Graham, why were you here?
I'm a bit worried about work at the moment with everything that's going on with the pandemic. And after the pandemic, finding my rhythm again, just feel a bit lost.
So, if you could have anything from working with, if you could wave a magic wand, if this was a magic wand, which it isn't, but if it was, if you could achieve anything from our work together over the next 6 months, year, 3 months, what would that be?
I guess I want a bit more certainty, want some direction around things. I feel a bit, as I said, I feel a bit lost. You know, I feel a bit scared about it all at the moment in the way the world is and where my world is. I just feel lost really.
And certainty and direction in what area of life?
Well, before the pandemic, I used to be motivated about going to work because then I could go on holiday, or on Friday night I could go out and go and do things. Whereas after that, it's kind of hit me and I've kind of lost my sense of purpose really. Just don't know what it means anymore, how work fits into it all.
Okay, so one of the outcomes you like is a sense of purpose around work.
Yeah, I feel I've kind of lost that. I don't know, what it means anymore going to work.
Okay, cool. So let's assume that we've got that, and you've now got that sense of purpose around work, and you are no longer worried about work and what that means, and you'd let go of feeling lost because you had that sense of purpose around work. What else would you like from working together?
I guess it might be a time to do something new, maybe a bit of freedom around work, and it may be a good time to actually think, well, that was then and this is now. So I think that the freedom around it, because I've always associated work with providing. So that's after everything that's gone on, I haven't had to go in the office all the time, and I've had more freedom. So I'm just trying to think, well, what could be a new way of approaching work.
Is there still a part of you that associates work with providing?
Yeah.
Cool. And if there was no association between work and providing, what would happen?
guess, you know, the word I'd probably use, I just get rid of my shoulders and I feel liberated a bit, you know, thinking, because, you know, it just feels like there's always pressure associated with work and going to work to provide for things. And now that, you know, the kids have gone, I'm trying to think, well, what's it all for now? You know?
So it's almost like, you know, there's a shed out there, isn't there, somewhere?
Yeah.
There's an apple tree over there. That old shed, part of that old structure is almost a bit of like you work to provide, and the new Graham is like focusing on you.
Yeah, I've still haven't really made that adjustment. It feels a bit weird. You know?
So there's almost something, a bit of a shadow of the past there around working to provide. Okay, cool. So if let's say you had that sense of purpose around work, and you absolutely knew what your purpose in work was, and you therefore lost that sense of being lost, and you absolutely had freedom around work because you'd let go of this old belief, an old pattern around working to provide, what else would you like from working together? Ideal world.
Well, you know, with the information you sent me before, one of the words that when we spoke on the phone was that I'm very tick list oriented. You know, everything's like must do this, must do that, and everything's got to have an outcome. So when I read through your pamphlet and we spoke about it, this word journey keeps cropping up in my mind. So I think, you know, I want to try and make it a little bit more freer instead of rigid about, you know, it's got to be this way, got to be that way, got to pay the mortgage, got to do this, got to do that. I want to make it feel a little bit more of a journey rather than, oh, I've got to do this, got to do that. It's kind of starting to get me down, actually.
So this, if we again use that analogy of the old shed and the old conditioning, being around having to provide and having to do stuff. So part of this, when you talk about journey, is that about learning to be and be comfortable being and relaxing?
Yeah, I guess I've lost touch with what I really want, and I feel the reason I feel lost is I don't know what I'm meant to be anymore around work. You know, it just seems to be that's it. I can't put any more words around it really. It's more of a feeling of feeling lost, aimless.
Yeah, okay.
You know, no direction and what the hell's going on, you know.
It's interesting because I was telling that metaphor before around the client. So it's funny how things happen in threes. That it was talking about purpose and the emptiness syndrome and that lack of purpose. When so sometimes when we have an identity and our identity is around providing, or then when it's a bit. Also, I was talking to somebody recently about health and how they're trained and they've been training previously for vanity. And then now they're not as vain, the motivation to train has disappeared. But they want to train because they want to be healthy. But the motivation's almost not there. It's like when we're making this personal development journey, it's like, oh, okay, I'm making changes, but now some of the motivation's shifted and I feel a bit strange almost.
Yeah, it's almost like I'm wearing a baseball cap that says Dad on it. And now that I don't have to do that stuff, perhaps that baseball cap needs to change. But American friend who talked about that, you know, so yeah, so I guess like identity really. I don't, you know, with work and everything else, everything's changing with the empty nest. I just feel, what am I supposed to be doing every day?
Cool, okay, awesome. So there's a great book recommendation which I'll come on to. There's a great book called Manhood, which I don't know whether I've recommended before, but it's just a brilliant book for men. Basically talks about some of the issues with the Aussie therapists, written in the 90s, lots of Billy Connolly references, so I love it. Great book because it basically explaining how men struggle with, because who were our role models, and often the role models since the Industrial Revolution, men were off to work, to provide, to be busy. So this idea of focusing on yourself and what's right for you is sometimes a tricky thing, because the model is of a worker, of a doer. And of course we're not human doings, we're human beings. So I'm getting that sense of that journey. So I just want to check before we move on, if you had that sense of purpose around work and a sense of lightness and freedom around work, and the sense that it was a journey rather than a tick list of things to do, what else would you like?
I'm not sure there's anything else around that. I guess that I kind of think I know where I'm blocked, but I don't really know. You know, so that's really why I was compelled to come and talk to you about it. I kind of felt there were things that were missing, but I don't really know what's missing. I can kind of talk about it, but I don't know what the feelings are around it all. And I've been feeling a bit down about it recently, a bit sad about it.
Okay. And Is it fair to say that you want to enjoy work?
Yeah, and it sounds weird that if you're providing, that's normally not high up on the list.
Okay. So actually, rather than focusing on providing, which was the old Graham, you want to enjoy it.
Yeah, so a sense of purpose, but not just linked to the purpose of providing. So you mentioned if there was a nice thing, it's just enjoying it just for me, and not and think I've got to do it for other people.
So enjoying work for you.
Yeah.
So if you were enjoying work just for you, and you were feeling like there's a sense of purpose around work, is there a lightness, a freedom around work? What else?
I think that's about it. And when we talk about it, I'll get that awful feeling in my stomach goes away.
Cool.
You know,
You mentioned that awful feeling in your stomach, so I'm going to ask what that is. What is that? When you think about working to provide and kind of the to-do list, what emotion comes up?
I just think I'm scared about making those changes. I know I need to make them, and I'm kind of, I don't like that word, comfort zone. It sounds a bit psychobabblish, but I kind of feel that way where I know I need to change, I know I've got to adjust, but there's part of me hanging on to that I like being a provider and I like having a sense of purpose around that. So I'm a bit conflicted actually about, what I'm supposed to be. That's,
Nice.
and so I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's difficult to put it into words really.
Yeah, brilliant. And of course, as MLPers, we can begin to see, so as just pause coaching session for a moment, listening to this, what I'm always looking for as a coach when I work with a client is, can we help get some clarity of what they've got? So I don't know how many minutes we're in, but we've now got a goal. So I would say to Graham, there's a task of I want you to write that goal around you having a sense of purpose around work, of you feeling the freedom, the lightness, and actually enjoying work for you. So there's the goal, and I'd give that as a task. We've also got emotions, a bit of sadness, a bit of emotions of feeling scared. There's also a part of me likes actually being a provider, which is often part of me what actually I want to change. And there's also a couple of beliefs. I feel a bit lost. I've always associated work with providing. My intuition tells me there's more beliefs around that. There's more beliefs that underpin this link between work and provision, that if we could let go of those. So I don't know how long we've been going. Not particularly long. And it's like anything, when you look at this script, there's lots of words on it. But really, when we understand what the purpose is, the bigger picture is, can we help the client get the goal, and can we ask questions to become aware of where they might be a little bit blocked? Is that okay?
How much of the script has he actually used?
Started with it. First 4 words.
Exactly.
Yes, on question 1, please.
Yeah, well that is why I didn't want to look at it, because I wanted to do this unconsciously, because this is not normally, thank you Graham, because this is not normally something, I mean Sean's been chasing me for months if not years to do this. It's not something you normally get to look at and watch. It's normally a very private thing. So for me, the difference between what somebody might do and what I would do with this is I don't move off I don't move off question 1 until I've got everything under question 1, and that might take 45 minutes, because for me a detailed person history might be 4 or 5 hours, and the client that might take place over 4 months, and they might have read 3 books over that period.
And that's why this is very misleading, because the first says it'll take about an hour.
Well,
So as a practitioner, you've just started a new client. I've got to get all this done in an hour.
Okay.
And this is why we wanted to do this, because having started using it myself, the idea from this is that this looks quite different by the end
Completely.
of this. And that, this becomes something that is more like what you would, what it used to be.
I mean,
And the real learning is you don't have to be hung up by this at all. It's the client, it's you, it's the
This
interaction
is
that
just,
matters.
for me, a tool, a guide, so if you ask
Prompt
that,
you get.
then you can utilise it.
Yeah, and that thing about the hour, that's describing the length of the first session, not the length of the process.
But you saw what Bevis did there. He just kept going round and round and round and picking and picking and picking. And then, at the end of it, he's got a whole list of things, parts and different, and unless you're intuitively taking it all in, you miss most of that. How many of you actually picked up the bit about parts or the bit about all the things he's just told us? It's very easy to miss all of those because we're trying to watch how to do it and take notes and all the rest of it. And when we're doing it with a client, we've got to put all the rest of it aside. Forget about what's for dinner, about the washing, about all the other things, and just focus on the words that are coming. And so many times Bevis is actually repeating Graham's words. I don't know if you saw that. You're putting the question back, utilising his words, so in his language. It's all about the client. None of it is about Bev's trying to pick up the bits, but he's just focusing totally on the client.
James Sale said that to me. Yeah, coaching is just repeating back to your client what they've just told you. I said, no, it's not, and then found myself doing exactly that in the next session.
I think what what I've always liked about the way you coach is the way you take and you reframe it so that by saying to them, so now if you have that, what else? That. I think what I found when I'm coaching is I tend to go down more of like the being intuitive about what is being said to you, but I find that I'm also they're getting stuck and getting too absorbed in that thing that's causing them the problem.
Yeah.
But you quite quickly just went, so if that was resolved, I mean you didn't put it quite like that, but if that was resolved, what else is there?
Yeah, and I think this is worth pausing on, because there's two I'm thinking about it, sometimes you don't know why you're doing what you're doing. There's two reasons for that. One, by saying, and what else? I've had clients go, oh, well, if that was like that, that'd be amazing. Oh, well, yeah, but what else? Well, actually, my relationship would improve a little bit. Oh, well, actually, I'd like to be a bit healthier. And we get people widening the frame of what's possible, as opposed to, I use this example quite a bit, but a phobia client, been working with 14 months, we haven't dealt with the phobia yet. But we will get there. She's coming on a course, and it will get sorted on the course, because it was not about the phobia, it was about her relationships. And actually, the part of the phobia is disappearing because the phobia was taken on board when somebody died, and it's more linked to relationships. And so the presenting problem isn't always the problem. So by keeping asking, the client goes, oh, this doesn't have to be just about stopping smoking. So it allows you to deal with the bigger picture, and it also allows you to not dive into a rabbit hole of dealing with, because my first client, she wanted help to overcome the fear of flying, and because I was so desperate to help her, I tried to help her with the fear of flying in the first session. Wasn't successful. And you know why it wasn't successful? It was partly successful because it helped, but she was about to have an arranged marriage, she didn't want to get married. So the fear of flying was quite useful because it meant she didn't have to go anywhere. So if we go down the rabbit hole of dealing with what the client gives you at the outset as the problem, we might end up dealing with something that isn't the problem.
There's another really important thing here. You've got the client, they've come to you, first session. What you're doing now is actually showing them possibilities, that it doesn't have to be the way that they've got at the moment, and you're giving them the first sort of tenuous stages of hope and possibility. And that's, if you don't do that, if you just spend all the time doing this, they'll go away thinking, well, what's all that about? But now you've actually started them on the journey, saying there's some possibility, there's more to this than I realised, and there is a chance that it could be different.
And so far we will do, checking on time, we will do a little bit more, but not too much more if you're happy, Graham.
Yeah, sure.
And there are two tasks so far. One to read, so I'll be giving Graham the task of reading the book Manhood, and I'll be giving the task of writing a life vision, which is actually more specifically around him enjoying work for him. Cool, because those two books are linked. That's the book is linked with that goal. Cool. So we've got this goal of enjoying work, this outcome of wanting to enjoy work for you. Can you tell me about the first time you ever remember? Well, actually, let me ask that question differently. Can you ever remember a time where you just did stuff for the sheer? When was the first time you remember actually doing stuff because you felt like you had to work to provide?
When I was a lot younger, and I was a paper boy, and I thought I had to do it, but I didn't know why I was doing it, and it was probably part of where I lived, and instead of getting pocket money, but I'm thinking, well, I'm still quite young, I don't really want to go out and do that, but in a sense I was providing for me. So I think part of what we're looking at here is not just providing for everybody else, but providing for me. And I think there's this association with me about work and providing rather than work being work. So from a very young age, I had to go when it was wet and windy, it's quite a young age, to leave the papers, and I didn't know really why I was doing it. I get some money and then the guy around the paper shop gave me some chocolate. Apart from that, I'm thinking, why am I doing this? Am I mad? You know.
So how old were you then?
It's about 12, 13.
So before the age of 12 or 13,
Mm.
you didn't really have a concept of work, probably.
No.
So before then, actually, life was, those early memories of work was about actually having to do it.
Yeah, and I think about where I was brought up and the people I was around. Work was work. I didn't know anybody that would say they enjoyed work. You know, there was, I go to work to earn money, or I go to work because I have to go to work.
Okay.
I didn't know anybody growing up and in my own family or in my immediate area where they go, well, work can be fun. So from a very young age, work was work. You know.
Yeah. And I think there's a question here around how do family and childhood link to this.
Yeah.
So who were pivotal people in your life that linked to this pattern of work being work and work being about provision and
Well, I don't know if the word stoical means anything, but you know, it was like ingrained. You know, so you get the same working class because I think everybody was fixated about work. It was their way of surviving. So you know, from a very young age, that was my imprint. It wasn't you just worked. You know, it wasn't about whether you enjoyed it. You just worked.
If I were to ask you what would be your intuitive answer if you just asked quickly if I said, do you believe you have to work hard?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It's almost part of that's been ingrained in me from a very young age.
Yeah.
If I don't work hard, I'm not a very good person, or I'm not a good family member. Yeah. Yeah. It's quite sad, really.
Yeah. So if I don't work hard, I'm not a very good person. Because ultimately, as kids, we all want to fit in, right? And if we all want to fit in, and if we see that a way of fitting in is to work hard, because if I work hard, I'm a good person, we justify our existence by working hard. So the idea, therefore, of a client very recently said to me that the idea of doing stuff for themselves seemed very selfish. So if our whole mould of our unconscious mind is to work hard to fit in, to justify being a good person, it's a pretty tricky idea to go and work for fun. And we'll probably pause shortly, but what emotion comes up when you think about having to work hard to be a good person or a nice person?
It just feels like a burden, really. You know, it just seems that, it doesn't make sense, really. Not as you grow older and you become freer and you start to explore, and that's why I'm here, really, to try and explore about there's got to be another way of being me, really.
Love it. Two more questions. If you were to guess what emotion is linked with that burden, what would you guess?
I don't think it's emotion, but responsibility. You know, I think that's another way of providing. I've got to be that way because I've always been that way. You know.
So a feeling like you've got to take responsibility.
Yeah. I think it's a lack of freedom. You know, it's like I've always got to be this way because I've always been that way.
You're doing really well. Awesome. So one kind of final question. If we now say that we don't know for sure, by the way, so we're normally in NLP coaching, we try and find what's the number one problem that's affecting the client's life. We don't know for sure that this thing around I have to work hard to be a good person, I've got to take responsibility. We don't know if that's the number one problem, but it's pretty high up there because they're limiting beliefs and they're quite high up the tree of subconscious problems. If you were to guess, and this is about question 12 I think on here, if you were to guess where this pattern of thought and emotion came from and what age it came from, what would you say?
I guess it would be when I first had to work and nobody explained to me why I had to go to work. It was like, it's almost like, it sounds a bit weird, a bit dramatic, but almost felt like a Dickensian child, I've got to go to work because I'm being told to go to work. There was no explanation about why you work or, it's just, you go to work.
And what was the, because the funny thing about creating these patterns is actually they'll help us for a period of life. Like I remember I had a limiting belief that I let go of and this is a good thing to do in sessions, actually explain your own journey. I had a limiting belief that I had to prove myself, which was great when I was working, because I worked really hard to prove myself, and actually led to success. But when I started running my own business as a coach, and then I started to react angrily to emails from the golf club, I was like, why am I getting angry about email? Why is that bothering me? Because the belief that I had to prove myself helped me all the way in my 20s and 30s, but in my 40s it was no longer helping me. So this thing you've picked up around having to provide probably helped you in certain phases of life, but where you want to go now, it no longer serves you.
Yeah, I just guess I'm just getting really tired of it, and it's wearing me down.
Yeah.
You know, it's something clashing with me, and I don't like it, and I don't want to carry on. I'm only here for one life. I don't want to keep, rehashing it really.
And I am going to write down I'm only here for one life as a limiting belief, just so you know. So last question then. If you were to guess, because if you're guessing it's your subconscious mind and you know about the subconscious mind or the unconscious mind, if you were to guess where that pattern of thought and emotion came from, you said early work experiences of the family and childhood and what you observed, if you were to guess what the positive intention of creating that pattern was, what would you say? Because there would have been a positive intention. What would have been the intention of this thing around having to work hard?
Yeah, well, I think the big thing that came out of it is accountability and responsibility, that it was my life. So, it was almost like I was pushed into doing that. But from a very early age, I realised that if I wanted to be something or do something, it was going to be down to me.
So actually, it gave you the ability to take accountability and responsibility.
Yeah,
Okay. Awesome. So actually, there's some positives for that pattern created at that time.
Yeah.
But now you don't need those anymore.
No, it's just I need your help with trying to understand the balance around that, because it still feels a bit weird.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, right? When you've got these patterns, and this definitely will be the kind of last point. When you've got this pattern around accountability, responsibility, I've got to provide. The idea of being free to focus on enjoying myself feels so far over here that we think, well, I'll either be hedonistically enjoying myself, living in Ibiza on a villa in my own, or I'll be taking care of family responsibility. We miss what the middle way might look like.
Yeah, you talked about an emotion. I think there's a lot of guilt around it all, feeling guilty about, what is work and should I have to keep working the way I did. So I think I feel guilty sometimes when I'm not working and when I'm not providing. It's, I think that's a major thing. I just realised that until you just mentioned that.
Awesome, Graham. Can we give Graham a round of applause? I think that's a well-earned round of applause, because it takes real courage to do that, to sit in front of a live group of people and be really vulnerable. So not many people, and there are not many people who are courageous enough to do that. So from speaking just as a kind of a wrap up, really, what we found is there's a task that I would give Graham and I think actually I'd suggest these would be good things if you have to accept them. Would be to have a look at Manhood as a book. So you'll really enjoy it. Write the vision of you working for you to enjoy work, and that middle way, because there still are things that you want to take responsibility for. So what's the balance between responsibility and you enjoying you? And and I'm not expecting you to find that easy, but also become aware of if you have a go at that, and you'll probably struggle because it's fighting the old pattern. Journal anything that's in the way of you. If you find it difficult, why are you finding it difficult? What thoughts come up? What emotions come up? And from an NLP coach's point of view, we've just found the emotion of sadness, guilt, and lots of beliefs. I've got to take responsibility. I've always associated work with providing. I feel a bit lost. I have to work hard. I have to provide. Part of me actually likes providing, and part of me wants to change. And I have to work hard to be a good person, which if I were to guess, was probably the number one problem that we need to let go of to help let go of that tether that's making it difficult to move.
So, to put a bit of sense of humour into all this, so you told me to look at my manhood, is that right?
But not too long.
Believe me, it won't take too long. It's been a very cold winter so far.
Give her another round of applause. Cool. So we've run over a little bit, so apologies for that time-wise. The pub is falling for some of us. So before we wrap up, though, I think it's important that we give people the opportunity to ask questions or share anything that they've taken from that. Is there anything you want to ask, or anything you want to observe, or anything you want to share? Any questions? Anything that you've learned that you want to share? Or are we all just desperate to get home? Or get home and have a good night's sleep? Anything you want to ask, or any observations?
I think the tools are there, and it's just more about listening and seeing where it goes, and just letting it go in the direction it's going to.
Yeah, so I think that's the key message of the evening, and a phrase we use often: not letting perfection get in the way of progress, and having a go, and then getting on with it, and remembering those 4 pillars. Particularly, you all know how to build rapport. Trust your intuition when asking questions. That the document is there as a guide. Moving from question to question is clearly going to break rapport. So respond to what's in front of you, what the client is saying, as we've just seen with Graham. So yeah, good message.
Quite interesting, I think. I remember a client I had, I did this and I wrote it all down, and I didn't know where the hell I was going. And then the following day I came in and picked up my notes, and it was right there in front of me. You know, I'd actually written it down, but I just hadn't seen it. Yeah. And I think that's where the experience comes in.
Sometimes you do look down, and from the previous session you flip back, okay, different filter, different time.
So writing it down.
Graham was talking quite a lot there. How do you keep up with what you're saying, or what you notice without sort of?
Yeah, so I'm definitely not writing down everything you're saying. So that's a really important point, actually, Jonathan. You're not trying to.
It's your own words when you write down.
Well, good question. So I tend to think of things as what is it that the client's aiming to get. So what's his vision? So I've made notes around sense of purpose around work, freedom around work, journey, enjoying work for me. So that's kind of, don't ask me why, but I'm going to scribble this because I'm quite visual. So I tend to think of in the first session, somebody quite creative might think about creating something around this. So I think over here, vision. What's the vision that they're after? Down here, I've got written down what are the beliefs that have come up. So I kind of segment the paper on a remarkable into. I have a little section here for parts conflicts, and then over here I have emotions that come up, and then the rest of the page is for actually the bits of the history that come up I think are relevant typically. So
that's what I did. So I have this, but I've also written out a sheet which has got a load of those it's just got those 4 or 5 subheadings: limiting beliefs, parts, and the different things, and then as I go through I just drop them into their categories. Just one sheet.
Would it be useful if we just pulled something together on that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just for taking notes. So you've got almost your ideal person history script here to reflect on, and then we've got obviously something that you can use to actually scribble your notes on. Good. Lovely. Wow.
I think that gives a lot of clarity to show people how to manage that.
Yeah, I think that's such a good. You don't think about it; you just do it intuitively. So I think that's such a good point.
Yeah, if I'm trying to get down, trying to interpret what they're saying in a way that makes sense to me, I get lost in that bit, and then it sort of makes it a bit more clunky.
Yeah, and if you have that, okay, emotions, beliefs, their vision, but it helps. Actually, that is what helps me do the 4 points on the other thing. Make sure they have got vision, and make sure that I am helping them become aware of what's in their way. Because you only need to help them become aware of any. If you just came up with one emotion or one belief or one parts conflict that was blocking them from, then they'd become more aware than they were an hour ago.
That's really helpful.
It's funny, isn't it? The simplest things that you forget that you do. That, yeah.
It used to be great when I tried to clean his office. I used to see all that. Now he's got this thing. I never see that.
Cool. Okay. So, I'm sure we told some metaphors, didn't we, at the start?
Started with a story of one of my first coaching clients, and he'd asked me for some coaching. And guess what my first reaction was when he asked me how much? I simply said to him, well, let's just meet and see how it goes. And I went home and I got my pad out, and I kid you not, for 3 pages I wrote questions with gaps for answers, and then question and question and question. Because I was so nervous, I guess, and anxious about making a difference in this 1 hour, because this guy's going to pay me and no one's paid me for coaching before. I must have my questions all set out. And I arrived he was staying at his parents in Norwich, and I arrived at the house and I sat down, I got my pad out, and I got it all set out, a glass of water here, and he was sat opposite me. And I asked the first question, and he answered. And I looked at the second question and I thought, that third, fourth, no, none of those. I closed the book within the first 2 minutes of the session and just started to trust the stuff we've talked about. And at the end, he gave me £20. And I was so proud of that £20. It was amazing. It just led me into a realisation that I didn't have to have that much preparation to be able to have a positive effect with the conversation I was about to have with Ben.
It's interesting thing, isn't it, about fulfilment? So I know that 20 quid means a lot to Paul. So somebody I met earlier, and their first £5 from cutting hair got a £5 tip. He's framed it. So this is the chap who sold his business for, I don't know how much, but it'll be a lot of money. He's framed that £5 because he did it, because he's doing it because he enjoys doing it, not because he's trying to achieve it. And I don't really have a metaphor to finish off, other than to say that I did crash the car, or the box of fruit landed in front of me, and it only landed there because that was the precise moment where I did it.
That was a confession.
You might drive home because he's crashed the car.
I keep forgetting Jules is a literal listener and I'm an inferential speaker. We will get there eventually. So the box of fruit did land on the bonnet, the front, take the panel off, and you know what? It only did that because I was there at that precise moment. If I hadn't been rushing, if I'd been going a bit slower, or a bit quicker instead, it wouldn't have done that. So of course Wayne being Wayne, who got a bit sick of my NLP ranting, said, "Ooh, what would the law of attraction say about that, boss?" And I was like, and came back to him, not that moment, but the day later, might have been a week later. I said, "I think he was telling me to slow down, Wayne." Because of course when we're going quickly, when we're rushing, we're missing stuff. So we'll just leave it there, shall we?
Yeah.
Get a rush off.
Yeah, good.